So if you're all ready for me, all right, welcome to the first lecture in the series of the Classics in Archaeology Learning Community. This is the first time that we inaugurate this because we have so many wonderful faculty, part-time, adjunct, postdoc, you name it. They have every title except the one we actually want to give them, which is a tenure track position. So the more of you that come here, the more relevant you show that our work is. So please support us by showing up. In return, those of the Classics in Archaeology minors who are here, please go to Clara Goolsby, who is our work study and Classics in Archaeology major and a biochemistry major. Go to her and sign up. At the end of next semester, we will give you 1 credit for attending this lecture series. The way we set up this lecture series, by the way, I'm Katerina Zachary, I'm the professor of classics and chair of classics and archaeology. So the way we set this up is all of you who are interested can sign up in this non-instructional Brightspace platform where the speakers about a week or 2 in advance will post something for you to read, and you can post any questions before or after the lecture, and the speakers will be responding to you. So that's the practice that we are starting this semester. What we also prepared for you is to, except from offering this nice meal for you, we want to offer you something for your intellectual appetite. And for that, we have created a new flyer that shows you how you can fulfill all the core requirements at LMU by taking courses with us. So you can, if you haven't really signed up as a minor, you can fulfill the LMU core and pick up a minor with us. We're one of the liveliest communities on campus. My colleague Caroline Sauvage is on leave this semester, but she's the director of the Archaeology Center. And next week, my colleague Heidi Fessler, who is Professor Fessler, who is there, she will be hosting the archaeological reports in the Archaeology Center, and students will be giving you a rare tour the only time this semester. So same time next Thursday, 3 students will be presenting. So to introduce today's speaker, I will say that I wanted to invite his best friend and fellow student, Chris Gibson, our postdoc instructor. You know them both, and rather than me taking up the time, I can only tell you how proud I am for both of them to have completed their PhD and be my colleagues. It is indeed a rare opportunity for me to be graced with this. And so I want Chris to introduce Jordan Christopher, who will be our first speaker on hydraulic politics. Chris Gibson will do the introduction. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. So, it is my immense pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jordan Christopher. He got his BA from here in this very department in 2013 with a senior honors thesis, Goodness, a Brief Examination of the Ethics of Confucius and Socrates. This interest carried him through all of his graduate studies around the world, first getting his MA at Durham University in classics, but then going to Shanghai, going to East China Normal University for his MA in Ancient Chinese Philosophy. And then finally, he went to Canada, well, almost finally, where he went to McGill University, began his PhD studies, but then trekked all the way to the University of Munster to finish his dissertation titled Periphery Triumphant, The Pioneer Kingdoms of Macedon and Chile. He's in talks right now to publish it with Cambridge University Press in a new series, or parts of it, in the series Antiquity and Global Context. He also does research on ancient infrastructure, and besides his talk today, the paper of which has passed peer review. and will be published and back in Wenke Bergen's forthcoming place and performance in ancient Greece, Rome, and China, Jordan has also written on comparative roadworks, elite competition, territorial mentalities, and diplomatic frameworks of Greece, Rome, and China. So with that, I'll invite a Eta Sigma Phi member, great scholar and great friend, to talk with you about hydraulic politics.
So does this work? Yes, okay. Hi everybody. In reflecting on the nature and uses of water, Thales, the so-called first philosopher, declared water as the universal primary substance. The text of the Tao Te Ching, a critical work in early Chinese philosophy, extols its excellence and its power. It benefits all things. It flows naturally from high to low. The necessity for water to sustain life is well known, and water distribution systems are critical infrastructure in all developed cities today. This was no less true in the ancient world. If one begins with the simple observation that water flows in the path of least resistance, then one may characterize urban water distribution networks as systems that alter the least resistant path for it to flow down. Thus, one may say that water flows in the shape of the powers that act on it. Physical pipes and canals constitute the physical forces that control its flow, but in fact, one might go further and suggest these structures, being man-made, are subject to the influence of socio-political forces themselves. Water flows in the shape of power, and this can be seen clearest through a comparison of the development of the water distribution systems of mid-Republican to early imperial Rome and Western Han Chang'an. At first glance, the water cultures and systems of Republican and early imperial Rome and that of Western Han Chang'an may appear to be so vastly different that they would defy any attempt to meaningfully compare them. Rafe de Crespigny has even cited the difference of climate-related water circumstances between Rome and China as a primary reason for why comparative studies should not be engaged in at all, placed amid a list of factors that would, amusingly, each provide a fascinating basis for a lengthy comparative study. Indeed, if one persists in such a comparison regardless, a clear ideology of water becomes apparent in both the Roman and Chinese contexts that goes further to explain these massive differences than the more obvious and immediately apprehended causes of climate or technological limitation. The urban landscapes of Rome and Chang'an have already proven to be fitting subjects for other forms of comparison, including a notable comparison undertaken in Chang'an 26 BCE by Carlos Nareña. As part of this comparison, Nareña attempted to sift through the more immediately obvious differences between Han Chang'an and specifically Imperial Rome to reach a kind of underlying study of what he labeled as the logics of urban form. Through his study of physical forms and spaces in these two cities, including walls, parks, and palaces, he concluded that despite the obvious discrepancy that exists, quote, between a city dominated by palaces and one dominated by public entertainment complexes, both urban forms were more or less the same, since in both cities, these dominant monumental structures were vivid expressions of monarchic power. However, he adds as a last note to his comparison that if it were rather Republican and not Imperial Rome to be compared to Chang'an, the results would be quite different. Applying Nareña's logics of urban form to an analysis of water distribution networks and structures, one can trace the development of water cultures as a political dynamic. The gradual shift from a Republican to an imperial urban ideology in Rome can be observed through the flow of the water itself. Equally then, the water infrastructure of Han Chang'an evidences a distinct Han water ideology. The comparison between the two outlines just how distinctive these systems, normally discussed in terms of economic or engineering achievements, can be in terms of socio-cultural foundations. When discussing the water infrastructure of ancient Rome, one immediately thinks, of course, of the network of aqueducts that entered the city from many directions by the imperial period. On the subject of these aqueducts, we must turn to Sextus Julius Frontinus. Frontinus, towards the end of the 1st century CE, looked back as best he could to the earliest days of Roman water infrastructure. We have no reason to doubt his assertion that in the first several centuries of the city, water for Rome, in this early phase, was supplied by a mixture of river water, wells, and springs. Hodge has noted the high water table of the city being conducive to the easy tapping of wells. Wells at this time were essentially in private hands and to be found in the inside of houses. In time, however, Rome developed a tradition of constructing aqueducts to supplement this natural supply. Attempting to trace the history of each, Frontinus describes how water in the mid-Republic was routed always for the public good, and only used for baths or private supplies with the express consent of the citizen body. He writes, quote, "In going back to ancient laws enacted with regard to individual aqueducts, I found certain points differed from ours. With them, as in the Republic, all water was delivered for the public use, and the law was as follows. No private person shall conduct other water than that which flows from the basins to the ground." For these are the words of the law. That is, water which overflows from troughs, which we call lapse water. Even this was not granted for any other use than for baths and fulling establishments, and it was subject to a tax, for a fee was fixed to be paid to the public treasury. Some water was also conceded to the houses of the principal citizens with the consent of the others. Frontinus depicts the waters of Rome as explicitly politicized for a kind of public good in their uses and management, and indicates that increasingly luxurious baths and frequency of private supplies would have been alien to the earlier Romans. However, it seems likely that Frontinus is, perhaps unknowingly, simplifying and glorifying the past a bit. His distance from the Republican context he's writing about veils him from the fundamental truth that in early Roman waterworks, as in every other aspect of early Roman life, public was never really just public. Seth Bernard's recent monograph, Building Mid-Republican Rome, specifies that public construction in the early to mid-Republic was explicitly politicized in ways not often fully appreciated. Through a close study of Livy, Bernard makes the case that at the start of the mid-Republican period, the notion of public versus private ownership of resources, such as land and construction materials, as well as organizing labor itself, was quite fraught. Bernard notes that at least part of the reason for such tension was a discernible link between public construction projects and a supposed oppression of plebeian citizens. This is particularly noteworthy with regards to the early Roman construction projects, such as the Capitoline Substructio, Temple of Mars, and the Republican circuit walls. The walls in particular likely entailed corvée labor obligations of such severity that, according to Bernard, it is the construction of these walls, following the Gallic sack of 390, and not the sack itself, that can be held responsible for the marked lull in both economic activity and monumental construction in Rome between 400 and 350 BC. Proceeding to the end of this lull takes us into the beginning of a particularly fluid period in Roman economic and power dynamics. The construction of the first aqueduct in Rome by Appius Claudius Caecus in 312, the Aqua Appii, is a core part of this shift. Caecus was himself supported by what Livy disparaged as the, quote, factio forensis, the forum faction. In this period, coinciding with shifts in economic activity, new classes of elite Romans were arising in the politics of the city, and Caecus's entire career is wrapped up in all of it. While this is not the place to expound on the restructuring of the tribes he undertakes to seemingly better represent these groups politically, or his hand in the construction of the Via Appia, which shared out land connecting those same tribes to the south of the Ager Romanus, I will note it as evidence for a basic statement. His political constituency was made up of freedmen as well as the increasingly wealthy humiles, rather than the ancestrally fortunate patrician clans dependent on agricultural income. Noting this, we can examine his construction activity in a new light. Relevant to our purpose here today is the Aqua Appia, which he undertakes without clear or pressing resource necessity. Indeed, it must be pointed out that at the time of Caecus's activity, it was not yet the norm for censors to take charge of major urban construction. Another point of note is the aqueduct distribution terminus in the Forum Boarium. The Forum Boarium is not an aristocratic hub of the city. The aqueduct, from its inception, would never have been able to service the hills of Rome, and this would have been known by its designers before the first shovel went into the dirt in its construction. However, a terminus in the Forum Boarium suggests the intent to create a new spring in what was essentially a market exchange center in the city, which can be linked to the economic activity of the Humules. The Boarium itself would go on to be densely inhabited, with attestations of early multi-story construction, as well as fires taking place in the area. Clearly, this aqueduct did not and was never meant to service Rome's established elite as much as to enhance the livability of a sector of the city inhabited by men engaged in the kinds of trade and craft practices that would naturally lead them to gravitate towards Caecus's faction. Notably, Caecus stayed on in office longer than would have been expected. Beyond this, Diodorus Siculus claims that the project was paid for with public funds, but without senatorial approval. While one might suggest a selfless motive for this, it seems more likely that Caecus stayed on in office to better ensure the route and construction of the aqueduct proceeded according to his own best interest. With the construction completed, the area helped contribute to the broader trend of mobile labor markets in Rome. The second aqueduct to be constructed, the Annio Vetus, is recounted as being paid for in 273 with funds seized from Pyrrhus of Epirus. Notable, however, was the effort taken to once again route an aqueduct 4 times the length of the Appia to end up again not servicing the hills. Penelope Davies has linked the constructor of the Annio Vetus, Manius Curius Dentatus, with Appius Claudius Caecus politically, and has explicitly suggested that the motivation of construction of the Annio Vetus owes a great deal to both Caecus's prior actions with the Aqua Appia and the continued consolidation of the political elements Caecus had elevated. More than this, Frontinus also does not indicate that this construction was a response to urban need, which he does specify being a motivating factor for the third aqueduct, the Marcia, in the 140s, a decade wherein Rome's military victories obscured domestic dissatisfaction, which would ultimately explode in the 130s with the tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus. It is therefore reasonable to speculate at political considerations behind the scenes in its construction, at work outside of resource requirements. As such, from its inception, work relating to bringing external water into the city was both motivated by and contributing to the political atmosphere of the city itself throughout the Republic, but also reflecting the changing political realities of the city as well. The development of the aqueducts over the course of Roman Republican history bear out a slow but clear shift in intentionality and purpose. While it is beyond the scope of this paper to trace the history of every aqueduct at length, the continued politicization of these projects is explicitly attested by the uproar over the routing of water to the Capitoline Hill and the failure of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus's planned aqueduct in 179 BC when Licinius Crassus refused to allow the aqueduct to cross his land. Note as well that Lepidus had been charged with using public funds for privately beneficial waterworks previously. By the time of Augustus, aqueducts were no longer being constructed solely for the service of potable water or population requirements. Frontinus writes about as explicitly as can be expected for an imperial author that the Aqua Alsietina was built with the purpose of supplying water to Augustus's Naumachia. The notable lack of castella, these distribution basins that route water everywhere, lack of castella of the Alsietina, which are common on other lines that actually enable water to be routed to many locations in the city, further bears this out. The quality of the water of the Aqua Alsietina was regarded as barely potable, only truly fit for non-human consumption. Frontinus tries to give Augustus some credit, suggesting that it is useful for supplying the Trans-Tiber district, where a lot of foreigners lived, when other routes are down for repair. He also suggests that the excess supply beyond the need of the Naumachia went to gardens and farmlands. However, I would suggest that if indeed Augustus justified the construction in this way, which is not at all certain, the idea that the aqueduct would also be used for gardens and irrigations is amusing, considering aqueducts were routinely illegally tapped for such purposes anyway. Justification of the construction of an aqueduct by claims that it supplies non-potable water consumption demands is simply the recognition and recasting of a long-standing problem with Roman water networks as an intended benefit. It must be specified that even for the purpose of constructing an aumachia, a bespoke water supply was not necessary. Julius Caesar, in developing his own earlier naumachia, did not require such extravagance, and almost certainly relied on the waters of the Tiber for this purpose. Beyond reckless expenses, such as the Aqua Alsietina, Augustus, of course, continued to justify expenditure for the improvement and maintenance of the city waterworks. This is where another feature of water becomes quite apparent: water's ability to reshape and reform. Like a river cutting deeper into its bed, once the waters of Rome had begun to flow, the political situation in the city develops on the assumption of its continued presence, turning Caecus's unnecessary and politically motivated expense into a necessary expense for matters of state stability. I would suggest that constant expenditures on maintenance and supplementation suggest that the flow of water was a political factor of key importance. Note that under Augustus, Agrippa himself was tasked with the renovation of the waterworks, which also led to a construction of a number of new fountains in the city. I would go further then, and suggest that perhaps to panem et circenses, bread and circuses, we should add aqua, given the ease of its accessibility in certain districts surely contributed to social stability in Rome. The case has now been made that water infrastructure development in Rome is not set on an inevitable progressive path from primitive barbarity and wells to civilized modernity and aqueducts, but rather follows along an entirely culturally path-dependent evolution. Or, to put it more simply, that water in Rome is flowing in the shape of the powers that act on it. To go further to prove this point, I believe that rather than remain in the Mediterranean, where other water distribution networks are tied up in networks of intellectual exchanges, the best course is to completely leave the Mediterranean behind and examine a water distribution system built by and for an equally advanced culture with both the material and manpower resources to rival Rome at its height, that of Han China. By the time of the Western Han Dynasty, the nature of water supply and drainage, both urban and rural, was well understood. Indeed, before diving into the particulars of the Chinese case, a massive difference with any Mediterranean context must first be noted. The landscape of China is conducive to severe flooding from its rivers. As far back as the prehistoric or mythical figure of Yu, a sage king whose efforts to quell a catastrophic flood lead to his emplacement as the founder of a great dynasty, flood control in China has been a major concern among the inhabitants of the region. The ease with which some regions flood was a continual concern, and not just for urban planners, but even for military tactics. The flooding of enemy cities and armies are reported regularly, and the Muozi advises its reader on methods to defend a city against a flood attack. It suggests arranging the city to be basically a giant drain and keeping a stockpile of boats on hand in case you need to sail out and deal with the siege. Indeed, the role of water in China is such that the text of the Guanzi explicitly points out that the major natural disasters for a ruler to be wary of, including of those disasters, flooding is the most serious, as even though there are many types of water and many beneficial uses for water, control over water cannot be maintained for long, and when loosed, it can ruin landscapes and even society itself. The floods that were endemic to China could and did completely shred dynastic authority with enough severity to cause total governmental collapse, as happened in 11 CE when the Yellow River broke its dikes, leading ultimately to the collapse of Wang Mang's Xin dynasty. The construction and maintenance of major canal works were thus something of a tradition, and the state of Qin famously embarked on vast canal work projects itself. However, despite the accumulation of centuries of experience in building complicated waterworks, Han Chang'an never developed a complicated system of permanently flowing aqueducts bringing drinkable water to the public. Average residents relied on wells for their potable water, and wells were largely private utility items within households, as in early Rome. However, that is not to say that there were not canals or aqueducts in Chang'an. In fact, there were several, built at distinct times, all servicing the city and its environs. However, the motivation of their construction and the locations to which they flowed all bear a distinctly Chinese signature. Water flows in the shape of power, and when the power structure is completely different, then it makes sense that the water systems look completely different as well. Chang'an was a city of palaces, not a city of citizens. However, these palaces were not just domiciles for their ultra-elite owners, but instead massive gated compounds where numbers of servants were resident and bureaucrats would work. Penetrating these complexes further in detail is difficult, however, as the attention of our sources rarely focuses on the affairs of these elements of society. However, the city itself was not an ancient site of primordial habitation, but rather a consciously chosen location near to the old Qin capital of Xianyang. Located in the Guanzhong Basin, surrounded by mountains but with easy access to the rest of China through the Wei River, its location was strategically quite sound. The Wei River was located only around a single kilometer north of Chang'an. Most residents of the city, both within and outside the walls, therefore relied on groundwater retrieved by wells for drinking. Water was initially plentiful, as the capital was served by 8 to 10 rivers which cut throughout the basin, recharging groundwater. The water resources of the site were such that Michael Nyland has explicitly noted them as a primary reason for the siting of Chang'an, where they actually sited it. Population growth in the early phase of the city was driven not by birth rates, but rather by the forced transfer of large numbers of wealthy inhabitants from elsewhere in the empire, as well as the rapidly expanding Han bureaucracy, supplemented by voluntary migration of labor to the area to make use of the economic opportunities that resulted. Water in this early phase was provided by a channel routing water south to north through the city into the Wei River. However, a mix of population growth and climate change caused the city to be in danger of water shortage. The quantum leap needed in Chang'an's water supply came during the reign of Han Wudi, 157 to 87 BC, who constructed the Kunming Lake in 120 and expanded it in 113. Able to store 3,500 cubic meters of water with 2 supply canals partially diverting the flows of the Hao and the Chui rivers. This man-made body of water was immense, measuring about 4¼ kilometers east to west and about 5½ north to south, and purportedly was deep enough to sustain mock naval battles for the perusal of the emperor. From this lake, a stone dike brought an even and continuous flow of fresh water into the capital city. The dike further enabled excess water in times of floods to be dispersed around the 6-kilometer route to the city itself. This dike split into 2 lines to better control the flow, each of these being around 200 meters wide on average, which routed through the Jianzhong Palace complex and terminated in Taiye Pond, while the other routed on a limited aqueduct platform over the walls and into a reservoir pond in the Weiyang Palace complex. Zhang Jianfeng has noted that the result of these large water projects, beyond stabilizing a flow of water that was temperamentally tied to rainfall patterns, also functioned as a kind of climate control for the palaces and parks. Once water entered the walled city, it was routed through a complicated network of canals and pipes to other palaces and subsidiary canals and pipes to other locations. Just as in Rome, the matter of drainage was one of serious consideration in the construction of Chang'an. While fresh water was routed through largely open-air canals, which followed meandering routes throughout the city, drainage and wastewater routes were occasionally routed below ground and covered up by brickworks and complicated networks of pipelines, especially in the palace complexes, though the more common form of drainage outside the palaces were open-air. Also supplementing drainage passages was the practice of building ditches alongside roads and placing roads slightly lower than the surrounding ground level. Correspondingly, while the freshwater canals are essentially not preserved, vastly more remains of the wastewater routes. Unfortunately, however, because most archaeological work has focused on palaces, no major conclusions can be drawn at this time on the water systems across the whole of the city, at least beyond the walls. With the conclusion of the reign of Wudi, there were no further megaprojects of this type. Traditionally, this transition away from state activism was related to a supposed lack of funds in the later stages of the Western Han Dynasty. However, this has recently been strongly argued to be an incomplete explanation, masking intense ideological shifts occurring within the court during and after the reign of Wudi. Han Chang'an does not have any attested or archaeologically discovered public fountains. This might seem like a triviality, but it is worth pointing out that public fountains are an inherently socio-culturally motivated invention. The Roman urban landscape after the leveling of the Forum Valley was such that it encouraged citizens to mix together for civic and political purposes. Despite the very basic realities of wealth disparities in different neighborhoods, Roman elites in the Republican period attempted to overcome this wealth disparity between citizens in recourses to a kind of imagined community, as attested in the endless inscriptions and reported speeches wherein Roman elites used terms like apud vos, among you, and other idioms in an attempt to create a sense of solidarity. Public fountains are, in a sense, this sentiment given physical form. The Roman dynamics that led to the construction of aqueducts embody elite control of governance, seeking legitimation from the beneficiaries of mass projects. In Rome, elite status being maintained by acknowledgement by a mass of citizens is clearly discernible in the water system. Chinese rank hierarchies are in stark contrast to this, where, far from being equal under the law, one's rank could have very clear consequences for how one was treated by the state. This rank hierarchy did not depend on communal approval, and instead derived its authority ultimately from the emperor, who was nominally not supposed to even be seen by his own subjects under normal circumstances. In contrast to Roman networks of publicly accessible water outlets, Chinese palaces were serviced by groundwater wells and reservoir systems located towards the exteriors of the complexes, nearby to servant workstations for such things as cooking, and alternately, at the edges of main palace buildings, these wells and their placement reflect the necessity and low status of wells in the Chinese city. Lacking public baths and fountains, and with drinking water a private concern involving groundwater wells, the complex networks of canals and drainage pipes throughout Chang'an was associated with palace complexes and aided greatly in luxury and beautification, and the relative dearth of them in more public areas of the city, such as roads and the market, suggest their lesser emphasis. Zhang Jianfeng, briefly analyzing the socio-political relationships of Han Chang'an and its water infrastructure, noted that the drainage systems of the city effectively created clear partitions between artificially designated areas. One might suggest that the mixing of personnel between these areas was subtly discouraged by the very flow of the water within the city. The notion of a public fountain would have been massively out of place in such a water culture. The next point to note pertains to urban water supply in relation to control of the urban population. I follow Bernhard Linke and Hans Beck in the assertion that Appius Claudius Caecus, in his censorship, acted to secure a previously non-politicized element of society to support him. I would further specify that the creation of the first aqueduct simultaneously is catering to and reinforcing that certain demographic in the city for political reasons, increasing the quality and convenience of their water supply through the use of public funds without a senatorial decree. Water lines in Republican Rome essentially all display elements of this ad hoc design, a result of the chaotic nature of politics in Rome's republican system. Note, for example, how water enters Rome from all directions. In Chang'an, it enters basically from one route. Republican political dynamics are completely inapplicable to a Chinese emperor or their bureaucratic servants. As such, consider once again the stone dike splitting in two on its way to Chang'an. One route leads to a palace, delivering fresh water to the palace systems and those who rely on it, and connecting up to various civil administration complexes. However, the other route, after servicing another palace, terminated in a pond outside the city, which aided in recharging groundwater supply relied on by the average resident. Zhang Jianfeng has suggested that some palace pools were not even used as reservoirs for drinking water, but for pleasure purposes, going by the remnants of aquatic life found in certain pool excavations. The routes and uses of water do not display any clear sign of any political interest beyond that of the prominence of the imperial clan and its associates. The palaces and administrative zones are the first concern, with even the route that recharged groundwater outside of the walls ultimately terminating within a palace complex. Lacking bathing culture and public fountains, with drinking water supplied by groundwater wells, there was no culture of elite competition for the acquiescence of the urban population. Imperial control over the urban populations in Chang'an was assumed, It was a city of aristocrats and functionaries, brought there by force of imperial decree and by it being the center of a massive bureaucratic network involving over 100,000 civil servants throughout the state. Beyond them, the myriad servants required for the operation of these compounds would also have directly benefited from the urban water infrastructure. However, those residents of the city not directly tied to this system, i.e. living outside of the walls, were of secondary importance, and their water supply bears this out. This is not to say, of course, that all servants of the emperor just passively accepted their lot in this aquatic status quo. Powerful and well-connected families of the city spent large sums to route water from the canals to their private complexes, using the urban water supply for their own luxury. But this was nevertheless still private use. And powerful families in Chang'an were only powerful because of their connections to the imperial household in one way or another. In one famous case that recalls the incessant problems in Rome with private tapping of public water resources, Wang Shang illegally broke a hole in the city wall to ensure a private flow of water to his property. When this was discovered by Emperor Chengdi in 33 BC, he held his anger, reflecting the accumulated power of the Wang clan at the time. Eventually, however, Chengdi was openly enraged when members of the Wang clan effectively repeated the offense in a more usurpatory fashion, and Wang clan members very narrowly avoided mutilation as a punishment. That none of this concern was made over necessary water, but rather over the legitimate or illegitimate uses of water for pleasure, and as usurpations as status symbols, projects an image of Chang'an's water resources as being in some ways detached from questions of real need. Frontinus, on the matter of water resources in the Republic, is explicit in laying out the importance of public decree and public welfare for the aqueducts bringing water to Rome. But in Chang'an, public welfare was a subsidiary interest to imperial desire, and it was the emperor and not the inhabitants of the urban environment that determined what was or was not an illegitimate use of resources. One can scarcely imagine an attempt to justify the huge expense of gigantic terraforming projects which lead ultimately to large flowing waters and lavish private gardens and palaces being acceptable conduct to the aristocratic classes of Rome during the Republic. In time, Republican urban logic faded into the logic of the Principate, and the culture of water delivered to politically relevant citizens appears to be replaced by something that would have been a little more familiar to the Han. In this new order, an emperor, in effectively sole control of public funds, could easily spend lavishly on water for his own interest, with the benefit of his subjects being a demonstrably secondary concern. However, unlike the Han dynasts, Augustus inherited an older logic, and his own expenditures would require him to continue the maintenance of the urban flow as a matter of political expectation. Imperial Rome was built on inescapably republican foundations. As such, where Imperial Rome does show similarities to Western Han Chang'an, its differences often derive from its vastly alternate background. To give but one such example, both cities could host grand naval spectacles on man-made bodies of water. But where Anomakia is entertainment, naval displays on the Kunming Pond appear to have been entertainment for the emperor. Thus, the flow of the water in Rome matched the constraints of Augustus's new, simultaneously limited but limitless authority in his state. The Chinese use of routed water bears little signs of such an inherited concern. The comparison between the two settlements in this way strongly urges a more foundational comparison into the very notion of what a concept of a city entails in these contexts, and suggests that this more primary investigation into a city's culturally encoded origins must be begun. Lastly, it suggests that one may be advised to resist the temptation in some comparisons of the Roman Empire and the Western Han Dynasty that treat these entities as unchanging monoliths, as though they emerged simultaneously and mature like Venus from the sea, rather than as structures which developed along clear, path-dependent, cultural, historical, evolutionary trajectories. Thank you very much.
So it's up to you. Raise your hands and ask straight away.
I have a question about it was really entertaining, really cool talk. I was just wondering about if there's any kind of information about the sourcing of the aqueducts and their political kind of dimension of choosing which bodies of water and rivers and springs they're drawn from in Rome. I think Frontinus talks a little bit about the kind of quality of the sources and how some of them were too muddy during rain. And there was one point where he mentioned, maybe with the Marcia, that they chose not to draw from a stream that was used by farmers around Tusculum. So maybe there was some kind of private political dimension there. Maybe the landowners could have intervened to prevent.
There is absolutely political dimensions to which water sources they're using, right? And it's fascinating at all that you hear about aqueducts not being constructed or being started and stopped because of these political concerns in Italy. Because if you go outside of Rome, there's arguments that you can sort of tell which settlements in North Africa are Roman and which are non-Roman because the Romans are stealing the water from the local inhabitants and routing it to their own settlements. I mean, outside of Italy, they don't give a damn whose rights it is. But inside of the Italian peninsula, where these people either vote or have connections to people who vote, you can't just step on someone's rights, right? So everything becomes political in that regard, as well as concerns about the water quality itself. There's another concern early on, which I didn't really bring up because we didn't have time for it, but especially early on, the nature of these aqueducts as external or underground is very important. The Aqua Appia, for a good long chunk of its ride into the city, is underground. And this reflects the standard practice of construction of water routes in many places in the Mediterranean, where you don't necessarily feel super confident that you control the whole countryside. Which makes sense in the early Roman period, that maybe if you don't trust your Italian allies, maybe if the Samnites still haven't been dealt with, you don't want to give them access to your aqueducts, so you make it hard to find, right? By the end of the empire, a lot of these things are just full over land because the Romans have control of everything for miles and miles and miles around. Nobody's ever going to come until the Germans come, and then there's problems. But that's way later on.
I had a question about the underground portions that you just mentioned. Do you know what the method for building those would be? Because I can imagine it would be relatively difficult to build stable underground chambers, especially if it's going underneath farmland.
They would go several meters deep, right? And they often have these things reinforced with bricks. In Greece, which is sort of the pioneer of doing this that I think the Romans were paying attention to, they'll often cut through direct stone itself. The bigger trick with the construction is not the tunneling, actually. The trick that they had to make sure they were following was making sure that they weren't getting a slope too long so that they would not, hit to below the city. And secondly, making sure that the route that they were taking was straight. And so in order to pull that off, they would often have little, almost like manholes, right? A good distance apart each, and so they would be able to come out, check, measure the distance between the previous manhole, make sure it was straight, and keep going, right? But these things are small enough that they're easily hidden and obscured. If you don't know they're there, it's hard to find. So that a lot of the route of some of these aqueducts is still not known because we can't find them, right? Ancient technology.
So the pools that you mentioned that were used for pleasure that had aquatic life found in it, like flora and fauna, were those in Rome and China? And then also, I just wanted to know a little bit more about those pools.
The use of gigantic amounts of water resources for pure pleasure practices, unless you're talking about baths, is a particularly Chinese thing, right? They're the ones who decide, well, we're going to mix our water infrastructure with ponds for the pleasure of the elites to hang out in, which doesn't really service any kind of public good, and these palaces are all restricted access anyway, right? So when we talk about things like Rome and urban beautification, so much of this relies on an underlying conception of what a city is, which in our Western tradition we just assume. So we can make sense of Rome, but we have to be very careful when trying to make sense of Chang'an. When the Romans are building a fountain, everybody can come to the fountain, right? When they are building a bath, more or less everybody can go to the bath. When the Chinese are building a palace, no matter how beautiful the palace is, there's still guards at the gate who are checking your ID tags if you ever want to try to come in. And people who aren't supposed to get in, that's a death sentence if you let them in and they're not supposed to be there, right? So it's really a Chinese thing to spend this incredible amount of money on water that has no public benefit in that sense.
So what does, since so much of the Han water management system that we were talking about revolves around the imperial center of power, how do we see that work in other Chinese cities? And then later on, as power shifts and maybe like the capital changes depending on the dynasty, do we see people try to recreate the system that was in Chang'an?
The system that was in Chang'an seems to be the way that things will go from there, but it's not something that was invented just for Chang'an. It's an evolution across early Chinese history. And if you want to talk about other Chinese cities, the evolution is tied to the larger trends of the Warring States period, which, you know, if you take my class on ancient China next semester, you'll learn a lot about, where early on in Chinese history, we're talking like 700, 600, elites in China were sort of in a first among equals situation. There was one ruler of a state, but the other elites can just sort of go out to his backyard and find him and just they're going to hang out and ask him some politically relevant question and go home. By the end of the Warring States period, you have a bureaucratic centralized state and a bureaucratic apparatus, and they don't like people calling themselves hereditary aristocrats. They don't even like urban inhabitants of the city. And so what you see in Warring States cities is something that you basically never see in Greek or Roman cities, which is they build a fortress inside of the city to protect them from the people of the city, right? And so you'll get, for example, in the city of Linzi, in capital of Qi, right, which is now in Shandong. That city has an older, big, square city, and then it has a smaller citadel area where the walls we know are built after. And get this, the walls between the citadel and the rest of the city are thicker than the walls protecting the citadel and the city from outside the city, right? There is a real paranoia about making sure that the people stay in their land. And you see this also with water infrastructure, because in Chang'an and in Linzi and in all these other Chinese cities, the direction that the water is routing in, the palaces and the rulers, they get it first. So if you're going to poison the water, you can't poison us without poisoning yourselves too, right? Chang'an, if I go back here, I can sort of point this out, right? These palaces in the south are more associated with core imperial functions in the imperial family, and then you have sort of imperial relatives and other apparatuses, and then markets and little wards way up at the top, right? And the water is flowing south to north. So the good water is always going to the rulers in their own little protected area, and then everybody else gets everything else, right? Chang'an is unique because it doesn't have a citadel, but arguably what the Han Dynasty is doing when they make Chang'an is that Chang'an is the citadel. And the conception is that this is the citadel and the entire region is our capital, right? That we don't need external walls because we have the whole of the Guanzhong Basin, and these walls is just the administrative citadel of our conceived land.
I'm wondering, in continuing the comparisons, when the Romans build a new capital, if a much more highly centralized and bureaucratized state, Constantinople, are there any broad changes in the distribution of water there that are perhaps analogous to those in China?
I'm afraid I'm not too familiar with late antiquity, so I didn't look into the water routes in Constantinople itself. That's a period that I very seldom touch on.
Yeah, I know it's many fewer aqueducts and some changes in the specifics of how water can be diverted or not, but I don't have the system tied to that stuff.
Well, I mean, I can flip it around and go the other way. I can go earlier rather than later.
Yeah.
When the Greeks are building water infrastructure, 9 times out of 10, big water construction projects are associated with tyrannies, right? It is in the nature of monarchical and sole rulership systems to spend the obscene amounts of money that are necessary to essentially create an artificial spring, right? So it would be interesting then to sort of see how Constantinople is approaching this problem. Does that mean it's more democratic? That can't possibly mean that. But then I'm not as familiar with citizen bodies within Constantinople in that period, so I can't say what it necessarily means about that city. Sorry.
I had another question. You may have mentioned it and I just missed it.
Yep.
But was like the control of the water supply, particularly China, where it's kind of like it starts with the rulers and then everybody else gets what's left over. When there was like, or if there was ever like kind of talk of an uprising or like any kind of thing that the people of the city were doing that made the rulers like angry, was the control of the water ever really weaponized more or less against the people?
Control of water was weaponized less in terms of poisoning supply and more in terms of creating dams and flooding out whole cities. There's a Chinese saying that when you flood a city, you make them cook on suspended pots, right? It's so common there that they have entire military conceptions of like, okay, what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to watch out for? There's one military manual of ancient China that explicitly says, like, if you are chasing an army that is in retreat, but you think they didn't put up a very hard fight and you're chasing them uphill along a river, stop because you're walking into a flood trap, right? It says it right there. Like, everyone is aware that these are the sort of the games that you can play with water, right? And so again, when we're talking about water routes in the city, these cities are often on inclines, right? So it's more about, I said poison, I shouldn't have said poison because that was very rare. It's more often that when things flood, the top of the city is going to flood first. That's the less important side, right? If things get so bad that it reaches the bottom, well, everybody's screwed then. But at least the royal family and all the central structures, they'll be safe to the very last minute, right? And that's the case in all of these warring states, capitals, and really Chinese cities generally.
I'm struck listening to this, how relevant it seems also for California's contemporary water issues. So I come from Northern California and grew up listening to all the stories of how Southern California steals our water. A friend of mine's a civil engineer, and he reminds me water always flows downhill except in the presence of money. So these issues of public good and private, and I think the lawns in Beverly Hills and these places that, again, it's more of an observation since you're not a contemporary California water scholar. But I do think it would be, worthwhile maybe for some contemporary policy managers and kind of these same fights. We also have a massive aqueduct here in California. Edmund Brown, it's his namesake, this thing to move water to SoCal. So I just found it really fascinating. As you're talking about all these dynamics, I'm like, I've heard all of this before, but here, as a native Californian, so
That's why we started with this. That's why we started with this.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah, so it's both old but extremely relevant today. These questions of water and who gets the water and where we route it and politics and So thank you.
The issue of water rights is a fascinating one, and I brought up the case of North Africa. I didn't get into the water systems outside of the capital cities because I didn't have the time. But there you start getting really interesting comparisons with the Californian case, because the Chinese are, they're not necessarily famous for aqueducts, which is why I'm willing to bet cash money most of you didn't know they had any aqueducts before today. They're famous for canals, right? They build gigantic canals that route water every which way. Especially after the fall of the Han Dynasty, they built the biggest ones. But they start doing this already during the Zhou Dynasty, and they have mythical traditions of managing floods through canal building, going back into prehistory, where if some of these people are historical, which they're probably not, you're talking about people from back like 2000 BC that they're, would be doing this. Issues of who has water rights and who lives, this is something they debated as well, especially because the Chinese are historically stuck in a cycle regarding their water resources. And it's fascinating, and it's not tied to the capital city at all, but it's something that it's tied to the whole cyclical theory of Chinese history, wherein the Yellow River and other rivers will break their dikes eventually, right? It's almost inevitable. Every time it will happen at some point. And so a dynasty will fall, a new dynasty comes in. When the dynasty falls, it's often tied to this flood of some kind. There's been a revolt, there's been a famine. This new dynasty comes in, they're going to spend all this money to build the dikes higher and make the river lower. And so they spend all this money on water infrastructure. The dynasty gets old, gets a little bit more corrupt. They spend a little less, and the water rises naturally because the Yellow River is incredibly filled with silt, right? As ancient Mediterranean historians, we're familiar with like, oh, the Nile has lots of silt. It's nothing compared to the Yellow River. I used to know the percentage statistics, but the Yellow River is multiple times as silty as the Nile. And so it raises on its bed very quickly. So these dynasties, they have these nice dikes when they first come to power. Time passes, the water rises, the dikes aren't necessarily being taken care of because as the water's rising, it's more and more expensive to maintain these levees. Eventually it breaks. Now the dynasty has no money because it's been spending all this money, and a new revolt will come in and the whole cycle repeats, right? There's a lot of these interesting theories that sort of argue that Chinese history is stuck in a cycle, and that's one of the more prominent ones.
Well, I wanted to congratulate you for this fascinating talk, so very well delivered, and give you the opportunity not just to congratulate you for this, but to also talk to us about the new courses he's teaching right now, Axial Age, and next semester he'll be teaching a course on ancient historians where he will be comparing
Greek, Roman, and Chinese historical traditions specifically.
and another course, a new course.
Yes, a brand new course that, as far as I'm aware, LMU has never offered before. Ancient China in Classical Context. So for those of you who are even slightly familiar with ancient Mediterranean history, this course is designed to give you a strong familiarity with ancient China. And it's mostly a course on ancient China, but there will be key days where we compare major dynamics, major figures, major trends to equivalents occurring in Greece and Rome. So if this talk has fired your interest in China, I highly recommend taking that class.
I completely agree, and I want to again thank Jordan for giving this exquisite talk and invite you all to attend our future lectures. The next one is by Ben Radcliffe, and the title, that's right? No, Elliot Piros is the first one. It's Purple Motion, Pantomime, Dance, and Martial Epigrams. And then Ben Radcliffe, Metalwork and Works of War, The Poetics of Fragmentation in the Iliad. So this is this semester, and please don't miss those. I have to say, where would you hear something like this? And we made this place, we put LMU in the map by having people like you sharing your work with us. So thank you again, Jordan. And let me acknowledge his parents.